Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 119. And in this lecture, we're going to take a thematic look at consumer culture. And in doing so, cover a number of time periods we've been examining at this stage in the class. So rather than a strictly chronological advance of the course, this lecture instead will take a look at a number of time periods, backing up a little bit and reviewing some time periods that we examined previously, and then also discussing the period we're examining now in the post-World War II period. We will examine those time periods in this lecture thematically in regards to ideas of youth and see how that concept of children, youth, being a teenager was deeply influenced through consumerism. This is a good example of how, again, so much of American history, modern American history, can be revealed through a focused look at consumerism. In this case, we'll see how what we often think of as so separate from consumerism, notions of being young, childhood, being a teenager, were actually defined through consumerism. As a consumer economy develops in the late 19th and early 20th century, with it comes a new notion of childhood. Prior to this period of mass industrialization and the development of a consumer economy, the idea of having a childhood, having a distinct period in one's life when you aren't yet an adult and have the responsibilities associated with being an adult, it's really only in this period that that notion of a childhood develops, because in the 19th century and going back further into the colonial period, when you were a child, you were expected to work. You did have the responsibilities of adulthood. It isn't until the early 20th century that changes in the economy and society carve out a distinct period in one's life when you are not obliged to work, when you are dedicated instead to development. And we come to refer to that period in one's life as childhood, and then also later in that time span, adolescence. Childhood, adolescence, these are very modern concepts. They really only develop in the 20th century through the development of a industrial consumer economy. Because in agrarian pre-industrial economies, children worked. As soon as they were physically able to work in the fields, they did so. You did not have this distinct period in your life when you were free from those obligations of labor. In the early 20th century, in the progressive era, as we talked about, child labor laws are passed that forbid children from working. Compulsory education laws are passed that oblige children to be not on the factory floor, but in the classroom. Advances in productivity, advances in standard of living no longer obliged families to have children work. Why did children work in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century? Well, you had a family income. You had a situation where all members of the family were obliged to work. Well, changes in the industrial economy, changes in productivity, along with prohibitions against child labor and mandatory education laws, meant that children could be excused from the labor of adulthood, the labor of working for a living. So now you did have this distinct period in your life where you weren't an adult, when you weren't obliged to perform the responsibilities of an adult, our modern concept of childhood. And so that develops along with a consumer economy, industrial economy. Trends in that industrial consumer economy, trends in American politics and society, the advent of child labor laws and compulsory education laws help to create what we now identify as the concept of childhood. And as that develops, that notion, brand new, of a childhood, of this period in your life when you are not obliged to perform the duties of labor and the responsibilities of adulthood, that develops contemporaneously alongside the expansion of a consumer economy. And that's the point I made at the very beginning of this lecture, that consumerism informed our sense of this new idea of childhood. We cannot conceive of that idea of childhood without consumerism. Consumerism marks that process by which you are living through a process of development as a child when you are preparing for adulthood and are excused from the responsibilities of adulthood. So our very concept of childhood is deeply inflected and influenced by consumerism. The idea of childhood developed right alongside the development of a consumer economy and culture and was deeply influenced by trends within that consumer economy and culture. It really wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th century that Christmas became what we understand it today, a great orgy of consumerism. Previously, it had been sort of a low-key, solemn religious holiday. But consumerism changes that. And in the age of department stores, gadgets, gizmos in the late 19th, early 20th century, Christmas became reimagined as a moment for exchanging gifts. So Christmas emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century as a commercial consumer holiday, and a great deal of it centered on giving gifts to children. In 1906, in the throes and thickets of the Progressive Era, there's the first major toy craze in America. One of many to come. Later with Cabbage Patch Kids and Nintendo Switches, there's this trend we see in the late 20th and early 21st century of an it gift every Christmas. Well, that began in 1906 with the teddy bear craze. There's this well-worn story of the hunter, Teddy Roosevelt, refusing to kill a mama bear and her cubs, saving them. And that led to a great interest in all things cute and cuddly associated with bears, including the Teddy, after Teddy Roosevelt, bear toy, the teddy bear craze. So this is very demonstrative of this idea now that being a child means you get toys and you get novelty through toys, through consumer goods. In the Progressive Era, there's a great deal of concern about progress, development, reform, and some of it centered on child development, making a better America. That was the great ethos, the great spirit of the Progressive Era. The way things are isn't how they have to be. And one thrust of that was to develop good citizens, develop through education, the great hope of progressive efforts, a better America by better educating children. And you really have the beginning of fields that we recognize today as child development. And a lot of the emerging science on child development and the gurus and thinkers behind it focused on training kids to be better Americans, better citizens through consumerism. For example, in the Progressive Era, a lot of child rearing experts advised giving parents an allowance so they had money to spend, and this would help them learn about saving, budgeting, make them good consumers. So if childhood is about education, it's about self-development, it's about a period in your life focused not on work, not on labor, not on earning a living, but instead education. If it's an age in the Progressive Era of mandatory compulsory education, well, one way of being educated was through consumerism. One way of being educated was being a smart consumer. One way of being educated as a child is learning to be an adult. And that's why this advice about allowance, budgeting, was advanced by these child development experts. We talked in our lecture in the 1920s about how the 1920s is a new period of advertising, where advertising is no longer seen as informative, but instead a way of appealing to identity, psychology, anxieties, fears, freighted and loaded with larger ideals of freedom and meaning. And so advertising changes in the 1920s. And as with those changes came an effort to advertise directly to children, or to emphasize in advertising an identity associated with childhood, parenting, this again distinct period in one's life. This is good evidence of how we came to understand childhood and children and child development and the stage of one's life in regards to marketing, advertising, consumerism. Lionel Trains, a toy train company in the 1920s, had a slogan, "Take your dad into partnership, make him your pal," in an effort to sell train sets. Look here at this slogan. It's directed at children. It assumes they are buyers, choosers. that they are making the decisions in the family. It's a good example of how marketing recognizes children as potential consumers. In the 1920s, here marketing train sets. This advertising campaign isn't geared towards the adults who presumably have the money to buy a train. It's directly at the children, assuming they are consumers too, and can appeal to their parents to open up that wallet and spend money on a train set. And how do they appeal to their parents? Through, again, identity. Take your dad into partnership. Make him your pal. It's a point we made earlier in those lectures about advertising of tools. What's being sold here is family, identity. What's being sold here is the parent-child relationship. Yeah, I know they're selling trains, but they're doing so through identity. This notion of partnership, connection. Buy a train set and you'll be your dad's pal. Buy a train set and you and your dad will have this connection and kinship. So again, this is a good example of how consumerism comes to define what we might assume are periods in our life, identities that are separate from the consumer economy. No. Again, the big conceit in this class is that consumerism is totalizing. It defines modern American history. In this case, it defines what it means to be a parent and what it means to be a child. Many marketers offer their products as a way to make you a better parent or to make parenting easier. Life Buoy and later Life Boy soap urged kids to soap up, wash, and now an age that embraced antiseptic techniques. And it offered itself as a product that could help parents get their children to do that work of soaping up, washing their hands, something that many children are disinclined to do, with its messages that this was a fun soap, that it was something children would want to do, with cute, clever images from the advertising. Now you could do that work of being an adult and being a good parent, getting your kids to wash their hands by buying a product. So we've encountered this earlier, the idea that if you buy this product, life will be easier. In this case, if you buy this product, it'll be easier to get your kids to do what's often hard to get them to do, wash their hands. And so it's another way in which, again, what's being marketed here is, again, the parent-child relationship. We're coming to understand identity in relation to consumerism. Let's now zoom ahead to the post-1930 period and further our discussion of how, in the modern consumer culture, we come to understand childhood, parenting, these distinct periods and roles in our lives. It was the Great Depression, and that meant the economy was in the doldrums. And you might expect that, therefore, the expenditure on toys and other amusements geared towards children would reduce dramatically. They did, certainly ebb, but not to an end. There was still an effort to sell these products geared towards children and definitive of childhood, even during the scarcity and deprivation of the Great Depression. And that was often through creative means, through licensing, connecting popular cartoon characters to certain products. Now, earlier in the class, we talked about the brownies in our discussion of the connection between consumerism and another key development in modern American history, the rise of the American Empire. And we talked about how Palmer Cox was a key innovator in this process of licensing, how he licensed his cartoon characters, the brownies, to that Kodak Corporation. Following on that were other licensors who would build on that and greatly expand it, like Walt Disney, who's probably the most notable in terms of licensing his cartoons to sell a variety of consumer products. Mickey Mouse was a popular cartoon character who appeared in the short cartoons that would appear before feature-length films. One industry that thrived in the Great Depression was the film industry. As millions of Americans went to the cinema once a week and they saw Mickey Mouse cartoons, Little Orphan Annie cartoons, and the producers of those characters attached those characters to certain goods as a way to sell consumer products, to sell not just a admission price to a cartoon and build an allegiance and loyalty to that cartoon character, but to sell a bevy of goods associated with those characters. Mickey Mouse sold toothbrushes, watches, lampshades, later t-shirts, a variety of baubles and trinkets. So Walt Disney produced a cartoon character that was central to childhood in this period, Mickey Mouse, and then a bevy of other characters, Donald Duck, Goofy, and the like. But he didn't just sell that to American children as potential ticket buyers. He sold all kinds of goods, and there's sort of, again, a self-feeding reciprocal relationship here. You go to the cartoon, and you watch the cartoon, and you love Mickey Mouse, and then you want to go out and buy all of the goods associated with Mickey Mouse. And then when your life is surrounded by these physical reminders, watches, t-shirts of Mickey Mouse, well, you want to see more cartoons, right? So it's a very clever effort to indeed urge consumers, and in this case, parents and children, into consumerism despite the ravages of the Great Depression. A key landmark year in this process of marketing simultaneously a consumer product of cartoons or film and a number of toys and other trinkets associated with that cartoon was 1937. In that year, Walt Disney released a landmark film, The Adventures of Snow White. But before the film itself appeared in theaters, there were already figurines of Snow White, Prince Charming, and the Seven Dwarfs sold in toy stores. And so what this did was it whetted your appetite for the film. You could buy the figurines and then later see the film. Buying the figurines tied you to that film. It was almost as if by buying the figurines, you were already buying a ticket for the film. It sort of locked you into that. And then in 1939, you started to see the release of Pinocchio toys ahead of the release later of that film. So first you market the product that builds an audience, whetting the appetite for the film, and then you go see the film. And then after you see the film and love it, well, you go out and buy more toys. And now this is a mainstay of American consumerism. Whatever child-geared film is coming out because it's already in the Happy Meals, right? The Happy Meals come out first, and then the film is released. So today, this is a mainstay of marketing to children. This reciprocal relationship between one consumer good, a film or TV show, and then a variety of other consumer goods. Well, it was pioneered maybe as soon as Palmer Cox and his brownies were used to sell Kodak cameras, but it was really advanced by that marketing genius, Walt Disney. And then after World War II, this again becomes a mainstay to such an extent that today we see it as natural. We're not really even cognizant of it because it has become so naturalized. After World War II, there are not just films to draw upon to sell toys and other consumer goods. There are TV shows. And TV shows continued what was pioneered by Walt Disney, this tie-in between consumer goods and forms of entertainment themselves, consumer goods. There were popular TV shows geared towards children in the 1950s. And then there were lunchboxes and toys and other consumer goods associated with those TV shows. One of the popular TV shows in the 1950s was called Disneyland. Disneyland was a TV show before it was a place. To build, again, whet appetites for the theme park he was building in Orange County in 1955, Walt Disney produced a series of shows in the early 50s called Disneyland. And of course, all the TV shows were connected to attractions and rides in the park. And so there were a number of TV shows about what would become Frontierland. TV shows about Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. So Walt Disney, again, genius in marketing and capturing the attention of the American public, and in particular, American children's imagination, made this TV show Disneyland that was basically an infomercial for the park Disneyland, with all these shows that would later be connected to rides and attractions in the park. And one of the shows centered on these brave, noble frontiersmen, Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. later celebrated in attractions in Frontierland. And from that came the coonskin cap craze, a cap based on a raccoon skin that was worn by Davy Crockett, the character in these shows, and then later sold in stores and, of course, at Disneyland itself in Frontierland. So it's so layered in this way, right? The TV show, the park, and the coonskin cap. The TV show, the park, and the consumer good. So it began in relation to film in Depression-era America, or radio programs like Little Orphan Annie would later greatly advance after World War II in connection to television. In addition to Walt Disney and the ways in which he tied certain consumer products, films, to other consumer goods, in the 1930s, there are a variety of other media forms and expressions geared towards and sold to children. We talked in previous lectures about how the 1920s was the beginning of the radio age. Certainly by the 1930s, amidst the Great Depression, the radio had become increasingly influential in American life, increasingly present. It was a form of entertainment in the home, cheap, and therefore particularly appealing in the Great Depression era. And in the 1930s, there was a cycle of radio programs geared towards children, exclusively geared towards children, imagined to be the exclusive province of children. And there was a time in the broadcast day, particularly after school, that was geared exclusively towards children. So one of the big ideas in this lecture is that consumerism defines childhood, that consumerism created a sense of what defines what it means to be a child. And a good part of that is the way in which consumerism defined children as a market segment, that there is this group of people defined by their status and stage in life, that they're not adults, that they are in this period where they're excused from the responsibilities and labors of adulthood, where they're developing into adults. They exist in that time span of life, and they can be marketed to with products deemed appealing to those children. So you knew you were a child because there were these products geared towards you exclusively because you were a child. They weren't for adults. They were associated with childhood. So children are a market segment. They're a group of consumers identified by the producers of consumer goods. And that experience of being part of that market segment and being a child is consuming these products that are geared just for you. There was a day in a period of time in the broadcast day on the radio geared exclusively to children right after school. One of the other effects of the Great Depression was that because children weren't working and there were no jobs to be had, they stayed in school because there was no work for them. Their only option was to stay in school. So you actually get an increase in school attendance during the Great Depression. And at the end of the school day, you headed home and you listened to a bevy of radio programs that were produced for children as an identifiable market segment. The Adventures of Buck Rogers, Charlie McCarthy, which of all things was ventriloquism on the radio, right? Even I could do that, right? I don't know what skill is involved in ventriloquism on the radio, but Charlie McCarthy was part of an act which was live, and you could see the ventriloquist who had great skill in performing, but then also once you've identified him, you can later tune into his program on the radio, which maybe wasn't so skillful in terms of doing ventriloquism when no one could see. Little Orphan Annie. There were a number of radio programs that were produced just for children. So children are being marketed to, identified as a bevy of consumers, and consumer goods are being made just for them. And those radio programs were on the air at a certain time where children were expected to be listening to the radio, when adults were still working or children needed to be entertained after school. So there's that period in the day that's marked for children. And all these radio programs sold you a bevy of other consumer goods, because during the radio program, they would move seamlessly from the story to a commercial. And the characters in the story, whoever was performing as Buck Rogers or Hopalong Cassidy, that same voice would tell you to buy certain cookies or breakfast goods or drinks. Later in the class, we'll talk about how this is eventually banned. This way in which commercials are part of the program itself, geared towards children who might not be able to, again, differentiate between entertainment and a marketing message, particularly when the two are so seamless. And so the radio heroes, the radio characters were telling you to buy consumer goods. And a lot of the consumer goods you bought tied you back to the radio program because they encourage you to collect stamps and other things that would later be associated with part of the radio program. If you've ever watched the classic now American movie A Christmas Story, it's a good way of dramatizing this period in American history where little Ralphie, the protagonist, tunes in every day to the Little Orphan Annie show, and he gets a secret code and then later deciphers the secret code. And what does the secret code tell him to do? Drink more Ovaltine, right? So the radio program tells you to buy a product, and the product then connects you to the radio program. So there were all these kind of marketing means by which the radio program was connected to various products themselves, also geared towards children, because now there are breakfast foods and cookies and drinks that are for children and children only. And then when you buy those goods, again, it connects you back to the radio program. Another form of media that developed in the 1930s, geared exclusively to children, at least in this age, comic books. And what we have here on the slide is the holy grail of nerddom, right? Action Comics #1, the most valuable comic book ever produced because it features the introduction of Superman. And though comic strips had been in production and print going back to the 19th century, going back to the broadsheet newspapers of the 19th century, the 1800s, with characters like the Brownies, the idea of a separate book, separate from the newspaper with a more elaborate story, the comic book, doesn't appear until the 1930s. And when comic books first appeared, they too were geared directly to children. So here's another example of identifying children as consumers, as a market segment, and creating consumer goods geared to those children, a way in which consumerism defines what it means to be a child. We are the people who listen to Little Orphan Annie and read comic books. Here is consumerism creating identity. One of the big meta ideas in this class here, the identity is childhood. Interestingly, Superman, the character introduced here in Action Comics #1, was created by two Jewish Americans, a writer and illustrator, and you could read Superman as an immigrant story or the story of an outsider. It's a story of a guy who comes from a distant planet. He's adopted by, an all-American couple from Kansas, and then he learns to assimilate, acculturate, learns the strange ways of these Americans. He learns to fit in, and then eventually becomes illustrative of the all-American ideal. All-American male, a guy who fights for truth, justice, and the American way. And that icon now of a global consumer culture was created by two Jewish Americans. So it's sort of an immigrant story or a story of an outsider who ultimately comes to represent the all-American way of living. The two Jewish Americans behind the creation of Superman knew what it was like to be marginalized, discriminated against. They knew what it was like to be seen as suspect, un-American. And they created a story of someone like that, Superman, who comes from a distant planet and doesn't immediately fit in, who eventually becomes not just a part of American society, but a totem, a marker of all things American. So you have comic books and the introduction of Superman and other characters who are now a mainstay of American life. Superman was so popular, introduced here in Action Comics, which is sort of a compendium of many different stories, he became a carved out separate comic book that was read by the millions a few years after his introduction. And then from that came Superman radio shows, Superman TV shows, and then many, many and continuing Superman movies. So again, as hopefully you've seen at this point in the class, one consumer transaction is not simply one consumer transaction. That every act of consumerism opens the door to more acts of consumerism. It's feeding that continuing desire for novelty. It's that fertility, fecundity of consumer capitalism. Superman may have begun as a comic book character selling comics for 10 cents to young Americans, but then he was later a radio program, a TV show, and then also used to sell t-shirts and all sorts of other consumer goods. So it's that ripples in a pond effect. It's that mutuality we've talked a lot about in this lecture, where one consumer good ties you to another, which reinforces the media form itself. You read Superman comics, you want to watch the Superman TV show, and therefore you want to buy the t-shirt. And when you're wearing the t-shirt, you say, why am I not watching the TV show? So you watch TV show, rinse, repeat, right, over and over again. What we have here now by the 1930s is an entire fantasy world, an entire world that's geared exclusively towards children. And that's the idea I've introduced here in these slides, that children are being told these are just for you. This form of entertainment and expression, these consumer goods, these movies, these radio shows, are just for you. They're not for your parents. We are earmarking and demarcating a period in one's life where you exist as a child, not as an adult. And you know you're a child because the consumer goods that surround you, the consumer goods that are made, produced, and marketed to you, you're told this is for you because you're a child, right? That's the big idea here in this lecture, that we come to understand what it means to be a child. We come to understand a certain moment in our life through consumerism. And media forms themselves, elements of consumer culture, really work to establish that by the 1930s. Now, today, we no longer associate superheroes and comic books with children alone. Today, for whatever reason, it's socially acceptable for 50-year-old men to be walking around with Batman t-shirts. So this is no longer exclusively the domain of children. We're all Peter Pans now. We refuse to grow up, right? But when these media forms were created, they were part of this process developing here in the early 20th century of indeed demarcating forms of imagination, forms of identity, and experiences as exclusive to children and children alone. Then comes television. Television, from the very beginning, building on developments in the early 20th century of previous media forms, radio and film, was heavily marketed to children. And from the very beginning, there were certain programs that were for children only. There was a certain period of time in the broadcast day, like radio that preceded it, for children only. Television itself, the set itself, the consumer good itself, the TV, was heavily marketed to adults in relation to their children in a baby boom era where Americans were having large families. If you look at the ad campaigns, the print ads and magazines for TV, there's a lot of imagery, emphasis in those ads that buying the TV will make you a good dad, a good mom. Because in a lot of the ads, there are kids saying, I don't want to go home. I'm going down the street to little Timmy's house. He has a TV, right? There's this sort of guilt trip going on in a lot of these print ads. You don't have a TV for your kids? Your kids would rather be at the neighbor's house? What kind of parent are you? Don't you want to give your kids the good life? So television, the television set itself, was marketed in relation to being a good parent by giving your children what they want, by giving your children this slice of the good life in 1950s America. I mentioned in a previous lecture that television is the fastest technological adoption in American history. We very eagerly and readily become a nation, as we remain to this day, of TV watchers. It's faster than a telephone, faster than radio, faster than the automobile, faster than the computer. Americans, through the course of the 1950s, come to love TV. But that process had to overcome some reticence and hesitancy by some Americans who feared the TV and worried about what it would do to their families. Well, these ads represent that process of getting over those misgivings. By here telling your consumer, the adults in America, that if they buy a TV, it will make them good parents. they won't be shamed as being the only family on the block without a TV. It'll keep little Timmy and little Sally home and foster family togetherness amidst the baby boom. So the television itself from the very beginning was marketed in relation to childhood, the wants and desires of children, and their relationship to a child as a parent. However, there was a great deal of concern in the 1950s about the effects of many of these media forms on children. In 1953, Frederick Wertham, a psychologist, published an expose of comic books with the very provocative and alarmist title, Seduction of the Innocent. Wertham argues in this book that was a huge bestseller, created a great deal of debate, led to congressional inquiries, and eventually the adoption of the Comics Code, a voluntary agreement among publishers of comics to adhere to a certain set of standards and principles. Wertham argues in this book that an unregulated comic industry that was, again, at this point, the exclusive domain of children, do you know what your children are reading, was replete with violence and sexuality. He didn't have any problem with the racism or sexism in these comic books, but he offers all kinds of arguments about how they are sadist, that they're filled with violence and satanic imagery, that they're making kids communists, right? It was 1953 amidst the Red Scare McCarthy era. So Wertham sounds the alarm. And he sounds the alarm in regards to a form of media that, as we talked about in the previous slide, had begun in the 1930s as for children and children only. You don't read comic books as adults, your kids do. But you know what they're reading? They're being seduced by the satanic images, these violent images. They're being turned into commies. And from that came a great deal of alarm that also affected how people felt about television and its effects on children. They may have been pressured into getting the TV by kids and goaded by the ads we talked about a moment ago. But now that the TV is in their home, what are the effects of it on their children? And in the 1950s, there were a number of alarmist articles in America about the effects of television on children. Warning of telebug eye, that watching the TV all day will literally force your eyes to pop out, and children glued to the screen will have this malady, or it will make them weak because they're not outside running around and building up their muscles. In the 1950s, in the Cold War, there's a great emphasis on martial power, military power, confronting the Soviets, right? American military might. And with it came a great emphasis on training the next generation of soldiers and sailors. So children had to be physically strong. This is how vitamins and white bread and other products were marketed to children, that they will make them strong. You could see white bread ads from the 1950s where little kids are lifting cars up and saving old ladies because they ate Wonder Bread, right? And yeah, that's a way of selling bread, but it was also indicative of this emphasis on strong bodies for a strong nation. We'll defeat communism by building up our health, and we begin that with children. So another strain, another element of the alarm regarding children watching too much TV in the 50s was associated with them becoming weak, because they're not outside exercising and, you know, playing baseball and getting ready to lift that car off of grandma, right? That they were passive, just sitting there like lumps. So it's really interesting to look at a lot of the publications and popular media in the 1950s, magazines geared towards middle brow America, mainstream America, because what we see in that is this nation in dialogue with itself about the effects of TV and what we have become as a nation of TV watchers. Eventually, this leads to government inquiries in regards to comics, in regards to television, and in regards to another concern of the 1950s, juvenile delinquency. Teenagers running amok in, again, their own mental and cultural world. If we're carving out in the early 20th century experiences that are geared towards children and children alone, well, are children in those experiences consuming different forms of media, from rock and roll to television, developing bad values and running amok as juvenile delinquents. There was actually a Senate subcommittee dedicated to investigating this problem of teenagers running amok, listening to rock and roll, driving around in hot rods, and becoming a social menace. There were Catholic and religious organizations that called for ratings and regulations regulating comics. From this does come the Comics Code. From this comes efforts to regulate television. And that ultimately leads to an effort to label certain children's programs educational. What happens to all this concern about the effects of television on kids? Is it making them telebug-eyed? Is it making them weak, and therefore we're going to lose the Cold War? Are they becoming seduced by terrible values, becoming influenced by the marketers? Well, the producers of television shows, eager to make us, as we were becoming 1950s, a nation of TV watchers, wanted to assure parents that when they park little Timmy and little Sally in front of the TV will not have these pernicious effects. So that led to the development of educational programming and certain parents groups, child development groups, coming out and approving certain TV programs as good, as educational, as enriching. So don't worry, parents. When your kids are watching TV, they're learning. Don't worry, parents. When your kids are watching TV, it's not making them telebug-eyed and zombie-like. It's enriching them. One of the reasons why we do become a nation of TV watchers through the 1950s and continuing to this day, because today, in the 21st century, still the number one leisure activity in America is watching TV. What began in the 50s continues to this day, even with all the other amusements and opportunities we have in the 21st century. We may not watch it on a TV anymore. We may watch it on a tablet or a phone, but we're watching a TV show. It remains our number one leisure time activity. And one of the reasons why that develops over the last 70 years is that whenever there's a concern about TV, like there was in the 50s about its effects on children, the solution to that problem is always more TV. When there was a concern in the 1950s about TV, comic books, potentially foisting upon children bad values or introducing them to pernicious imagery and influences, the industry producing these consumer goods says, no, we will assure you that our programming is good, healthy, and wholesome through forms of regulation, through seals of approval. There were many TV programs in the 50s and 60s that began with a seal of approval from a parents' organization. Much like today, you might tune in to Nick Jr. and before Dora the Explorer begins, Nick Jr. tells you this program will help your kids learn Spanish and social skills. This is now, again, a mainstay of children's programming, as we remain very worried about what our children are consuming in the internet age. There's YouTube and there's YouTube Kids, right? Just for you, and with it, the assurance that it's wholesome and just for children. A rating system, right, is established eventually for TV programs, telling you before the program begins, this is fine. It's geared towards children, right? So whenever TV encounters this resistance, it just reformulates itself to break down that resistance. And that began as early as the 1950s. When there was this concern about TV and its effects, well, TV promised you, don't worry, we're going to clean ourselves up. We're going to offer you these assurances. We're going to make programming that's educational and enriching. And so, yeah, park little Timmy and little Sally in front of the TV. A TV and TV watching experience geared towards children alone, and also part of their childhood, where they came to understand what it meant to be a child through TV, and TV defined certain experiences and programs geared to them as children. A couple of images to complement this. On the right, the cover of the paperback of Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent. And here you can have this very kind of, alarmist imagery here of children being seduced and manipulated in this way. By the way, paperbacks also became part of American popular and consumer culture in the 50s as part of the emphasis on education and uplift. When previously hardcover books were the only ones available and were very expensive, with this came the paperback, which was a way of bringing literature, and in this case, contemporary debates, to the masses. On the left here is an article from a magazine geared towards women, and a lot of this discourse about the effects of television on children was covered in women's magazines that were geared towards women. And here is an article about telebug-eye and the way in which that watching too much TV will have this ruinous effect on children. It's all demonstrative of, again, the debate about consumerism. Is consumerism good or bad? Does consumerism have pernicious effects on us, or is it ultimately freeing, emancipatory, pleasurable, and makes for the good life? Well, again, at this point in the class, you've got a heady dose of how really there's this jousting and debate between those two polarities in regards to consumerism. Television may have been celebrated in the 50s in the triumphalist narrative as good, positive, a brand new opportunity, visual entertainment in the home. But there were others on the other side of the debate who said, no, this is stifling, it's limiting, it's pernicious, it's manipulative, it's ultimately going to be very bad for your children. Faced with that, the marketers of programming to children deflected it by saying, no, TV is actually good. And here's the proof. We're going to make educational, enriching material. Don't worry about telebug-eye. Park little Timmy and little Sally in front of the TV. Let's now talk about another element of childhood or pre-adulthood that develops here in the early 20th century through consumerism. That of being a teenager, adolescence. Childhood is a period in one's life where you're free from the responsibilities, rigors, and demands of adulthood. That, as we've labored to argue and develop in this lecture, was first developed as an idea in the early 20th century as America fully industrialized and communicated through a bevy of consumer experiences, transactions, and expressions. But also in the early 20th century, there's the development of an idea that there's a moment in your life when you're no longer a kid, but you're not yet an adult, adolescence, teenagehood. And that too was communicated through consumerism. The Great Depression, as I mentioned earlier, was more likely to mean you would stay longer in school because there weren't really any jobs. In previous periods to the 1930s, when you reached what we might identify today as adolescence or one's teen years, you did not necessarily complete high school. You might start working when it was considered, again, appropriate. But that was less likely to happen in the 1930s because of the terrible economic depression, when jobs were scarce and whatever jobs were available, they were earmarked for adults who had to support families. So there was a strong compulsion, urging to not hire teenagers, to secure those scarce jobs for adults. And that meant you stayed in high school, completed your diploma, and had more time, therefore, to be around your peers and influenced by them, what they were listening to, what they are wearing. And that was formative in creating a sense of the teenage cult, the cult of adolescence, the experiences that are for us, through this process of understanding that identity in relation to your peers. And one of the things that you shared with your peers, one of the things that was part of that cult of adolescence, music that your parents didn't like, music that your parents rejected, music that was not for kids and not for adults. In the 50s, that's rock and roll. In the 80s and 90s, it's hip hop. But in the 30s, during the Great Depression, it was swing. Now, we might associate swing music today with older Americans, Grandpa Simpson or something like that. But in the 30s, swing was for young people. It was loud, it was assertive, it was aggressive, it had a strong beat, and you danced to it. And you often danced in a very provocative manner. moving your body around, women's skirts flying about, gyrations of sorts. So I know it's hard for us to imagine because we might think of swing music as the province of older Americans today, but in the 30s it was for young people. And it had this ability, because it was seen as so revolting to adults, threatening to adults. It was loud, it was assertive, and it was sexual. People gyrated their bodies. They threw themselves around. Again, women's dresses flew up. Very provocative in that way. It had this ability to, again, make a generational divide and tell teenagers, this is not your parents' music, and your parents hate this music. They do see it as threatening and unsettling. So this is, again, how we learn who we are, through consumerism and where we are in our lives. Swing music was for one group of people, teenagers, adolescents. From this came a great mania for swing bands, dances. In the spring of 1938, 23,000 Americans attended the Carnival of Swing, the Lollapalooza of the 30s, the South by Southwest of the 30s, the Coachella of the 1930s, a big swing extravaganza with all the great swing bands. And who were these thousands of people who flocked to New York? Teenagers. As the songs of swing and the sound of swing were so alienating to adults. Believe it or not, in the 1930s, there was a great mania and fear about swing as an early force of juvenile delinquents making children, in this case teenagers, run amok, because it was seen as bawdy and sexual and came from jazz, a form of music associated with African Americans. It created a great sense of moral concern, well before the manias later about rock and roll, heavy metal, and hip hop. I know it does take a little stretching of the historical imagination because of how we think of swing today, but in the 30s this was bawdy, aggressive, sexual music, and from it came a great freak out among the adults in America. But on the other side of Depression-era teenage culture were images that your parents liked you to consume, including a popular series surrounding Andy Hardy, who was a radio program and also a film character who represented the dutiful, obedient teenager who sacrificed for his family, who might sell a few apples to help the family make the rent. So a way of countering the generational divide regarding swing and offering adults an image of adolescence in the Great Depression that they could embrace was from the gallant figure of Andy Hardy, the obedient son. What began in the 1930s, a teenage years concept, a concept of adolescence greatly expanded after World War II in the period of relative affluence that we've now started to develop here in lecture. When in the 1950s, in a post-war economic boom, children did not have to work, and if they did, the money they earned in after-school jobs at the malt shop was theirs and theirs alone. It wasn't expected to contribute to the family income. In the 1950s, as we talked about in our most recent lecture, adults could find good-paying labor union jobs and earn enough to support a family. And that meant that their children didn't have to work, and if they did, their wages were their own. And so it's the baby boom era. More and more Americans are having large families. With it came a great concern, but also embrace of family life, family togetherness. The TV was marketed as a way of fostering family connections, keeping little Timmy and little Sally home and not getting into trouble as juvenile delinquents. There's a great emphasis on child development. Dr. Spock and his best-selling books about how to be a good parent. Recognizing, right, that your teenagers are not children, but they're not quite adults. 1950s saw a great boon in the field of child development because it was a baby boom era, and you wanted to be a good parent to your teenager, and so you wanted to give them liberty and freedom. Partly liberty and freedom defined through consumerism, where they could indeed spend their earnings, spend their allowance as they see fit. And they really became a key market segment with certain consumer goods, particularly geared towards teenagers, comic books, certainly forms of music, records, 45s that they could buy and trade, candy bars. In the era of the 1950s of relative affluence, in that autotopia we talked about in our most recent lecture, Americans were buying new cars, and they often gave their older car to their teenager when he or she turned old enough to drive. And when you inherited dad's jalopy, you could make it your own. You could customize it. And from this came the hot rod culture of the 1950s, where when dad bought a new car, he gave Junior his older car. And because it was a dad car, you wanted to paint it, manipulate the engine or exhaust. And from that came hot rod culture, where children or teenagers could also participate in the way in which automobiles defined one's identity in 1950s America. So in the 1950s, in an era of relative affluence, if you had an after-school job, your wages were your own. In a period of relative affluence also, you might not go to college or even complete your high school diploma because you could find a good paying union job and then soon buy a house when you're in your early 20s, enjoying that period. What began in your early teenage year, this idea of being an independent consumer with your allowance or after-school job wages as yours to spend, continued into your late teenage and early adult years as you transition seamlessly, learning to have become a consumer as a teenager and maybe don't graduate high school or don't go to college because of the prospects of good paying union jobs so available. So again, as we stressed throughout this lecture, part of thinking of yourself as a child and later teenager is thinking of yourself as a consumer and learning to participate in a consumer economy. And there's this transition where as a child you might have an allowance, as a teenager you might have after school jobs, and then in your late teens have your own full-time job, and that was increasingly possible in the relative affluence of the 1950s. From this comes again a sense of identity as participating in this consumer economy geared towards young people. There were increasingly forms of expression, consumer activities that were geared towards this population of teenagers who had money in their pockets and were eager to spend that money in their pursuit of the good life. In the 1950s, film begins to increasingly skew young. We'll talk in lectures to come how this really fully flowers in the film revolutions in the 1970s when Hollywood studios realize that their market segment, that's young people, and they need to make movies that are more connected to the sensibilities of young people. But that begins 1950s, when with television, you didn't have to leave your home any longer to see visual entertainment. And that meant that adults tended to stay home and watch TV. Who left the house to get away from their parents to go watch a movie? Young people. And that's why so many films in the 1950s, Beach Blanket Bingo, horror movies like The Blob featured teenagers as the main characters and were geared almost exclusively to children, teenagers in this instance. So this furthers again a sort of exclusive teen culture, that there are movies made just for you because you're now the movie-going audience. Adults are staying home and watching TV. There are a lot of gimmicks involved in this. 3D movies, also as a way to get you out of the home with something you could not see on television. Drive-ins again became popular with kids, teenagers having cars. They could go and drive and supposedly go and watch a movie, but really probably steam up the windows in the back seat. But at least the idea was you were going to watch a movie. The transistor radio was a marvel. Radios prior to the 1950s were big, hulking things that you had in your living room or parlor, and you had to go to them to hear it. But the transistor allowed for portable radios, radios on the go. And you could, again, listen to your music exclusively. One radio in the house in the 20s and 30s meant everyone had to listen to the same thing. A transistor radio meant you could go to your room and listen to the programming, the music just for you. In the 1950s, the 45 replaced the long-playing LP One song on one side, flip it over, play another song. Very cheap, accessible to teenagers with money in their pockets, and very lightweight and small, so they could again trade 145 with another. And this is really how rock and roll spread before MTV in the 80s and the internet today. You heard songs on the radio, and also you traded records with friends through these cheap, portable, lightweight 45 records. There is a whole culture of music developing in the 1950s geared towards children, rock and roll, the 45, and radio geared towards teenagers, rock and roll programming, and from that celebrity disc jockeys like Wolfman Jack and Art LeBeau here in Southern California, who made a name for themselves on the air broadcasting the songs you, the teenagers, wanted to hear that your parents found revolting. Rock and roll in particular is at the heart of the concerns about juvenile delinquency, this idea of children running amok, being influenced by. Now, the music form that has replaced swing as the music geared towards young people that was seen as bawdy, sexual, force of rebellion and transgression, and also a music form that came out of Black America. Rock and roll came out of the blues. White artists like Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis took black blues songs and brought them to a white audience. And its foundations in the blues, an idiom associated with African Americans, was part of the great moral panic associated with rock and roll. I've mentioned throughout this lecture different genres of music that developed in the 20th century that all caused this great moral panic. Swing, rock and roll, and later hip hop. And it's no coincidence that all of those idioms that cause this great moral panic, that these forms of music are going to lead to moral decline and civil unrest, all originated with African Americans. The moral panic and outrage by white America stemmed in part from the fact that these idioms did originate from African Americans, and they associated the perceived pernicious effects of these idioms with African Americans. Rock and roll was bawdy and sexual. The term rock and roll comes from blues slang for sexual intercourse. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? You rock and then you roll, right? Jazz also comes out of a slang associated with sexuality. And if you just change one vowel, you can understand what jazz originally meant. It's strange to think about an idiom of music, jazz, today that's considered so erudite and refined, right? Actually originated from a term associated with ejaculation, right? So a lot of these music forms are very sexual. They're sexual in their origination. They're sexual in their very names, if you know the history of them. And from this comes this great moral panic over rock and roll in the 1950s. And it's a moral panic that comes out of the music being so different, being sexual, coming out of idioms of expression associated with African Americans. It comes from a period where Americans are very alarmed and worried about children. It's the baby boom era, and from that comes this great bevy of concerns about whether or not we're raising moral children, whether or not we're good parents. It's the Cold War, and we're worried that commies are coming and they could seduce and influence our children. But also, this great moral panic about rock and roll, juvenile delinquents, is a product of consumerism. That there are these forms of expression like rock and roll, comic books, movies, that are being sold exclusively to children. Parents are keenly aware that there is an entire cultural and mental world that is closed off to them, that is for children and children only. This is, in many ways, the genius of such marketing strategies, where children and teenagers are being told this is just for you, and therefore it's special. Soon in a lecture we'll talk about fast food. We'll have an entire lecture dedicated to fast food, key artifact of our consumer culture, and we'll talk about the genius of the Happy Meal. Here's something on the menu that's not for your adult, not for your parents. It's for you and you alone. And that makes you special, makes you aware that you're different than your parents. Rock and roll, The Blob, and other horror movies, comic books, they're part of that. They are consumer goods that are for children and children alone. They are exclusive to children. They are special to children and teenagers. And parents are, by the 1950s, keenly aware of that and worried that they're closed off from these influences, that these influences are so strong on their children, that there's an entire mental world that's outside their command, outside their control. This is, again, a product of consumerism, this market segment identified, and the consumer products geared towards children. So in a 1950s America, where the emphasis was on conformity, consensus, all is right in America, that post-war ideal that we talked about in our most recent lecture, comes this fear of the unraveling of that consensus and forces of transgression that could unsettle that ideal, threaten that harmony idealized in the suburbs. And one of the forces that could potentially work to that end, the consumer economy, consumer culture of young people, which by the 1950s has fully developed from its origins in the early 20th century and been carved out as exclusive to children. The music they listened to, the films they watched. And so you get the moral panic amidst the consensus conformist era of the 1950s. In the 1950s, as part of this consumer culture that was deemed threatening, menacing, and troubling, you get the first publication of Playboy magazine, geared towards young adult men. The very first centerfold, the very first edition of Playboy, Marilyn Monroe. Hugh Hefner would publish Playboy, and it would emerge as a key part of the consumer culture geared towards young men, with its emphasis not just on sex, but Playboy featured articles about hi-fi stereos and wine and liquor, other elements of consumerism that were associated with the lifestyle of the young man in command, the Playboy. So here too, along with rock and roll, was another force of potential transgression that would unsettle the nuclear family ideal of the 50s, where you're imagined to contain your sexual energy to the nuclear family ideal. Get married, move off to the suburbs, dedicate yourself to raising children. Playboy was the antithesis of that. It said stay single, have fun, develop oneself more than one's family, develop a taste for fine whiskey, dedicate your expendable income not to, socking money away for a college fund or buying a bigger house, but to instead buying a fancy sports car or a hi-fi. So Playboy, too, was part of this youth culture for people in their late teens and early 20s that, along with rock and roll, comic books, was challenging that consensus conformist vision of the 1950s. As transgressive as rock and roll, Playboy magazine, and comic books may seem, the real rebellion to the 1950s and the world your parents made would not come through consumerism, but in modes of expression that challenge consumerism. And that again sets us up for where we're going as we now transition into the 1960s. In our most recent lecture, we summarized a number of expressions: Catcher in the Rye, the Beat Poets, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that are developing in the 50s and early 60s that really indicate the great cultural shift that will flower by the mid to late 60s of the counterculture. There is developing in the 50s a counter-narrative among the Beat Poets, novelists like J.D. Salinger, who argue that real rebellion comes from challenging consumerism, not engaging in rebellious consumerism. Listening to rock and roll, going to a teenage romp-style movie and buying a issue of Playboy might seem so rebellious and transgressive, but it's really working within the consumer economy. It's reinforcing the existing order that tells you the good life is one of stuff. Certainly Playboy magazine made that argument. It might celebrate a caddish, sort of rascal-like image of young male adulthood, but in the end it told you to buy. that was a marker of success in the good life. But the beat poets, the flowerings of the counterculture, indict consumerism, finding it empty, plastic, inauthentic. The counterculture that will fully develop by the mid to late 60s emphasizes breaking away from consumerism. You'd have environmentalism. You'd have the emphasis on living communally in communes, a fierce critique of corporations profiting from the Vietnam War. So though a lot of what we summarized on the previous slide speaks to teenage rebellion, and it did cause the great moral panic, though rock and roll and Playboy magazine might seem transgressive, the real rebellion's still to come. It's going to come from people who don't offer different forms of consumerism, but attack consumerism itself. People who are very demonstrative of the domination thesis that we've been developing throughout this class that argues consumerism is stifling, limiting in terms of expression. It reinforces inequities in wealth and power. That real liberation comes from divorcing oneself from the mindless rat race of more, in pursuit of a true individuality, a true expression. So we are now at this point in the class moving into the 60s, 70s, and lectures to come. We'll talk about that period as one of civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, the great social revolutions of that period. And a good part of those social revolutions, particularly in regards to the counterculture, offered a scathing indictment of mindless consumerism, advanced different ways of being in the world that weren't tied to more, rising through the corporate ladder so that you'd have a bigger house, a bigger car. Counterculture will argue there are different ways of being in the world. There are different priorities, different ideals. We're not all destined to get married, move off to the suburbs, and stare at TV. Success means more than material success. In the 60s, environmentalism will tell us not to waste, not to consume. In the 1960s, a counterculture will argue that capitalism corrupts rather than liberates. So, though we conclude here this lecture on the youth culture in the 1950s in an era of consumerism that could even contain rebellion, there's a coming rebellion that will target consumerism itself.